Okay. So hi, everybody. I'm Susanna Jolber, and thanks everyone for coming today. I'm kind of distracted while I'm letting people into the meeting. We have a few people in the audience, and we'll have public comment towards the end. And if you have a burning question you want to talk about before, go ahead and raise your hand. And if we have time, we can go ahead and go to you. You'll see your hand raise function at the bottom of the screen. So before we get started, well, I guess as we're getting started, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Counselor Megan Perkins to welcome everybody, and then we'll go through the agenda and what we're going to be doing today. So,
good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here for our, what is it, fourth meeting, something like that. Yeah. I'm just so impressed by all the work that's been done so far, and I don't want to talk too long because I know that we want to get back to work. Last week was a pretty rough week. There were some really hard decisions that were made regarding our houseless community, and it's sort of lit a fire under me even more to do as much work as I can, and hopefully as we all can, to make sure that we are doing everything we can to provide as many shelter options as possible. So thank you for all the work you're doing with this. And I believe Susanna Lynn wanted to make a little announcement as well.
Oops, I'm muted. So yeah.
Sorry, I had to get to unmute. That took a second. So just wanted to let folks know, hi everyone, I'm Lynn McConnell, the Affordable Housing Manager for the city. We are releasing this week an RFQ, request for qualifications, which will be a two-stage process in getting to our navigation center operations. And so this is intended, I felt like this was a group that could help me get the word out. It will go to publication, we'll start circulating it widely, when that time comes, which is hopefully end of this week. But just to let this group know, stage one is really just tell us what you got, community. If you have any interest in either operating a low barrier shelter or providing services that could be accessory to such a concept, please submit something in response to this RFQ. That is first stage. It's not graded or anything like that. We're just really looking for a list of all of the providers who are out there. The idea is that this will become our potential kind of quick strike procurement list for future needs around shelter and other operations. So please, please, please help us get the word out when this is released. The second stage of this RFQ will be then an RFP, and that is where we will identify a potential shelter operator for the navigation center and sort of get that all squared away. But stage one is very much open. Tell us what you got, tell us what the gaps are, tell us what we're missing, what should this look like, what are all the provisions that we should have in place in order to serve folks, both who are unhoused and also who are unstably housed and need a little assistance kind of retaining housing. So please let your contacts know that this is coming. If it's okay, Susanna, I'll have you maybe send it out to this group once it's officially released, and we'll get it out through sort of all the traditional channels, but did want to put a plug in everybody's ear right now. We'll have informational meetings. I think the return date for this first phase is July 13th, so relatively quick turnaround, but again, not graded. We just want to know who's out there and kind of start creating our list for opportunities that may arise in the future. Thank you.
Okay, great. Does anyone else have any news, kind of related news to share? Megan and I thought it might be nice to, okay, Anne, I'm getting a message from Anne Rand. It's okay, Anne, you can be a panelist if you want. Anyhow, if anyone has news to share regarding the houselessness front, we thought it might be nice to share newsworthy items. I know there's a sign up for the meal train for the low barrier shelter, and I can send that out to the group. Megan, do you want to say anything else on that?
Yeah, the low barrier shelter, for those who do not know, does not have a kitchen, and so they rely on volunteers to provide dinners and also to provide a sort of a lunch, breakfast, snack that the guests take with them when they leave. I did it. Let's see, was that yesterday morning? Yesterday morning, and I was packing bags at 5 in the morning because they need it there by like 6:30. So that one's a little bit harder to do, but if you're an early riser, go for it. And if not, they obviously need dinner help as well. And it's really easy to sign up online. I suggest getting together with your neighbors, your friends, your coworkers, whatever, and choosing a day. It's kind of a fun thing to do together. And they really need us as a community. And I also see Kathy's hand is up, by the way, so I want to make sure I acknowledge.
Oh, great.
Kathy.
Does that mean I can talk?
Yes.
Okay, well, actually, I put my hand up for a question for Lynn, but I also have an updated piece of information. But mostly I wanted to ask Lynn, is the main issue funding, and will there be funding for the RFP, or where does it come from? What's our funding situation to try? Because I think that people think, why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? And there's just no funding for the staff or space or whatever. So I was wondering if you could just speak briefly to funding. And then when you're done with that, Suzanne, I do have one piece of information I want to share.
Yeah, so in this case for the Navigation Center, Bend was awarded through House Bill 2004, $2.5 million for setup and operations. The goal here is that something needs to be operational as a low barrier shelter by June 30, 2022, or that money returns to the state. So we just got our contract yesterday and flipped it back to DAS at the state level. So hopefully we'll be receiving those funds in the near term. That's really what is allowing us to proceed with this Navigation Center concept. So absolutely lots of discussion about funding and needing sort of ongoing operation support. Really feels like that's one of the critical components right now. I will, if it's okay, give everybody a teaser that there is a subcommittee, council subcommittee working on ARPA funds and how those should be allocated. And so, we do expect that council has indicated a lot of that should go to housing and homelessness generally. So staff is working through what those proposals look like and bringing that back to council, but know that there will be ongoing meetings to discuss ARPA funds and other needs. This particular RFQ is funded directly by the legislature, which took some work to get Bend included in that bill, but we're thrilled to be in there and to have this money coming our way.
Thanks so much, Lynn. So the little piece of information I wanted to give is a few of us that are dealing with this issue of the unhoused wanted to see if we couldn't come together and work as in a collaborative method to do something that's either photographs and paragraphs or video, basically some of the faces of the homeless, to try to dispel some of the misunderstandings that the community has of who these people are and put a human face to the issue. And we're going to have a Zoom call tomorrow at 2. And if anyone in this group is interested in finding out how to join that Zoom call, just let me know. And I can get that information to you. So just wanted to let you know that's in the works.
Great. Anyone else have anything to share? Okay.
I did.
Barb, yeah.
I could do another, it's just a teaser, but we have an executive session next week. Executive session is when we discuss property transactions. That's all I can say. More to come. Things, it looks like, might have opened up on that front. At least a little bit.
Okay, great. Okay, so with that, I think we'll go ahead and officially start. So today's agenda, before I start sharing, we're gonna we'll go through the minutes from last time, and then we're gonna review the progress from last meeting. There were a few folks absent, so I think we wanted to go through and review what happened the last meeting and make sure we're making changes that are reflective of the group's desires. And then we're going to keep going on the discussion of the zoning districts, size and requirements and standards, but we're going to focus only today on the outdoor shelter type projects. And I think we'll go through the timeline, but we may need to add another meeting or two to get through the rest of it. But the outdoor shelter stuff, because they're not housed inside a building. Elizabeth and Pauline and I kind of internally thought that that's maybe where we should focus today, just because there's probably going to be more concerns about those type of sites, managed camps and tiny home villages type things, Veterans Village, than something that's enclosed and housed inside. So we thought we'd focus on that today. So let me go ahead and share and let's see. Oh, one last thing. Hans sent to me this morning the article in the bulletin. If any of you saw it on Seattle's houselessness plans to do sort of a village of 600 sites. And it's kind of an interesting article. So just FYI, you could check that out if you have a chance. So here we are, we're at meeting 5. And I just went over what we're going to talk about today. We'll have public comment towards the end. And then our next meeting is going to be July 14th. So we're taking a full month off. And we'll be continuing likely with the code language. We still need to discuss RVs as a temporary use or a more permanent type use for family members or folks that might need to host somebody on their property or in their driveway. And then I'll have some draft community input story map type concepts to review with you by then, which Kathy, actually your news about the pictures would be really helpful. So I'll probably try and sit in tomorrow on that at 2 o'clock, because that's the type of thing we want to portray on the story map. You know, this is the face of the folks who are struggling right now in our community, and put a face to the numbers. So I'll probably be talking to you about that. So that's for July 14th. And I just want to go back to where we are. We're here, we're at meeting 5. We were going to have the public open house outreach already kind of happening, but we have a lot of other stuff going on, and I'm not skilled in doing web design and things like that on my own. So we're going to push that out just a little bit and probably have that going on in July and into August. We'll have the online forum at that point, which I think is okay. We still need to do some work on our end for crafting the code language in a more of a draft form that people can actually respond to. So we're working through how we're going to do that and tie it into an education type sort of effort. And so council's also taking a couple meetings off, I think, in the summer. And so this will allow us to come back in when they're reconvening. So we may need to do an extra meeting in at the end to cover everything we need to cover. Does anyone have questions about the schedule before I move on? Go ahead and just speak up if you do. No, okay. So just review of last meeting, we went ahead and showed you the draft code language, which was probably, I don't know, good and bad in ways. I think we got a little bogged down on things, which is totally fine, but we realized we needed to probably drill down on each of the specific shelter types a little bit more and do some revising on our end and then come back to you a little more. So we're gonna talk in concept about these a little bit more today, and probably not go back to the code language until we have a little more direction from you. So from last meeting, we've revised the definitions, which I'll show. We've provided some recommendations on restroom and screening, which we'll talk about, and then screening for trash as well. We have some information on the review process. If you remember from last time, we talked about whether these type of applications should be a type 1 or a type 2. Type 1 is the kind of the minimal review process. Type 2 is noticing the neighbors and going through more of a land use process that's appealable. Type 1 applications are only appealable by the actual applicant. So if we have time, we'll talk about that a little bit more today, but we may not have time. And parking improvement standards, Scott, you had raised whether these can be gravel and versus paved. So we'll get into that. Basically, our development code requires that sites be paved, not graveled. And that a certain amount, if you're doing like a parking lot, you can use things like grasscrete, or which is like the concrete pavers with the grass coming up, things like that, but things cannot be gravelled. And some of the ADA spots need to be improved. So we can talk about that. We do have some safe parking applications. The Nativity Lutheran Church and Don's house is gravelled. So if somebody wanted, to vary from the standards, I think we could figure out how to do that. They did not go through a site plan review. They're under our safe parking program, which is allowed through the municipal code. So clear as mud, I know, but those are our parking standards. So just following up from last meeting, we changed the definitions. I don't know if everyone can hear it. Somebody's, if you could mute your mic, that would be great. Okay. Hearing a lot of squealing. Okay. So we changed the shelter definition based on your comments. A shelter means a location for overnight accommodation of people who lack permanent housing. A shelter may be permanent or temporary, and we realize we need to probably define what that means, permanent or temporary, and is either an outdoor shelter, a group shelter, or a transitional shelter. And we are going to revise the code language to put that definition up at the top. If you remember, we'd had it down lower, and we need to probably put it up at the top. So we'll come back to you with that. The group shelter, and remember, this is like the low barrier warming shelter, or the low barrier shelter we've got, means a building that contains one or more open sleeping areas, or is divided only by non-permanent partitions furnished with cots, floor mats, or bunks for use as a shelter. Did we capture that adequately from what folks recall from last time, or does that look okay?
Susanna, it's Pauline. I do realize in the shelter definition, we just need to change transitional to the multi-room shelters. So that's just a typo, but that's already in the draft for the group to know.
Okay. Anyone else have any comments? To go ahead and just mute and talk, because I can't see who's raising their hand. Okay. I think we're okay on that one. Okay. Multi-room shelter. So if you recall, we had this is the Project Turnkey concept, Bethlehem Inn concept, and we've been calling it a transitional shelter, which was confusing because of temporary, permanent, transitional, like what does that mean? So the group recommended last time we use multi-room. So that means a building that contains individual sleeping rooms for use as a shelter. Does that sound okay to folks? I see some head nodding. Okay. Okay, great. And then finally, the outdoor shelter, which means a site on which multiple mobile or permanent units are placed for use as a shelter. Sound okay? Okay. Yay. All right. So I think we're in agreement on that. Perfect. Okay. So just wanted to review, you've seen this information before, but just before we get into talking about specifically outdoor shelter examples, just wanted to review with you things that we've looked at before and do a kind of a comparison of size. So group shelters, we've got the low barrier shelter at 70 beds, Shepherd's House is 30 beds. Bethlehem Inn is a multi-room shelter. It's 148 beds. I want to check whether it is beds with varying room sizes. So some for families, some for individuals. Redmond Project Turnkey Project is 25 rooms. And then most of the other Project Turnkey examples are 40 to 60 rooms, depending on the city where these things are funded. And Lynn, do you want to say any more about Project Turnkey examples? You're more in the loop than I am on that.
No, unless there's something you need me to say. I'm
No.
not quite sure if there's something you're looking for there.
No, I think, it's basically, these are the hotels that are permitted to be transitioned into housing for houseless folks. Yeah.
Susanna,
Mhm.
Also, a multi-room shelter, we didn't put this on the list, but it could be one of the smaller examples, that sort of look on the outside like a single family home, but each of the bedrooms are used as shelters. So those, I think there's a few examples around town of 4 bedrooms or 5 or 6 bedrooms. So they could range from a hotel or motel sized down to a single family sized multi-room shelter, just as long as there's individual bedrooms.
Yeah, and then one thing to note too is that we do have like residential care facilities in residential zoning districts in town, and we do not even permit those through a land use process. So those are like adult foster care facilities and things like that. So that plays into the smaller type of these shelters as well.
I just have a quick
Mhm.
question. Where does like Saving Grace, Grandma's House, and then Cascade Youth and Family, the loft, where did those fall in?
Yeah, that's a good question. Elizabeth, what do you think?
Yeah, so our code has been through a couple of iterations, and some of those that you mentioned have been around for quite a long time, Stacy. And so the temporary housing provisions in our code, I think we looked, and that's what at least one of the shelters was cited under. I haven't looked at Cascade Youth and Family, but temporary housing, sort of the code provision we're looking at updating right here, is what at least some of them were permitted under, and some of them may even be older and have been permitted under older provisions of the code. And so with, code revisions over the years and the 2016 UGB update, that was a pretty big revision of code and permitted uses. That's been through a lot of iterations. And so it's hard to say what all of those might have been permitted under, just previous iterations of the code.
But I think if I may, I think Cascade Youth and Family, like the loft, would fit under this multi-room shelter definition. And then I think the other ones you mentioned would too. Grandma's House and Saving Grace would fit under this as well. Stacy, does that make sense? Can't see you, so okay.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much.
Okay. Okay, so
Suzanne, I
okay.
have a question. Could you go back to the slide? I thought you might ask us for a question. If
Yeah,
we had
sorry.
questions.
Okay.
Under the low barrier shelter, the 70 beds, is that still because of spacing for COVID? Could there be more beds in there than the 70? I think that they had purposely spread everything out, but that they could accommodate more once everyone's been vaccinated. So I just wondered if that number is, if it matters. But I think it could be larger, so that's what I'm asking.
Stacy, do you know?
So, well, I hate to say something I'm not positive, but I do believe that number was determined by the fire department as well for space. And we know that realistically, we have such a high rate of vaccine hesitancy among our unhoused populations that I think 70 beds would be the max. I don't see everyone getting vaccinated, but I would have to confirm about the fire inspection as well. Right now, I know that they're having approximately 25 people per night.
Okay, so the 25 is for the COVID protections, and it could go up to 70 for fire. I guess, what do these numbers mean in the long run? Is it important? Does somebody come in and proposes a low barrier shelter of more than 70 beds? Does it cause a problem? If it's irrelevant, then I don't care. I guess I'm just thinking that if we're putting these numbers someplace, are we just comparing? This isn't something that's going to be codified.
Just to clarify, the 25 just happens to be how many of our unhoused population are coming in each evening right now, but they do have, I think, 70 beds set up in there currently. When I was in there, they've got them spaced for COVID and also just so people have a little breathing space.
And I think it's dictated by building occupancy more than anything. So I'm not sure how large that site is. And yeah, these are just for comparison's sake, just so you can have an idea. And I'm sorry, I skipped over the outdoor shelter. examples. So we've got Veterans Village, which is 15 sites with a community building, the Micro Village Center, which is 10 and a community building, and also a single family residence. And I sent out the PowerPoint to this last night in hopes that it might make more sense to you if you could look at it. So we'll be looking at those a little more closely, but just one question that came up last time was on these outdoor shelter sites. Should we be regulating by the number of units, or sites is confusing to call it because we're calling them outdoor shelter sites, but the individual like campsites or building pads, should we be limiting it by zoning district by the number of building pads or sites or units, or should we be looking at it based on the square footage of the site and then putting in some sort of ratio, like 500 square feet per site? And so that came up last time, and we thought it would be useful to go through some of our existing ones and talk to you about that and just kind of do a reality check on how many units you really can fit on one of these sites. And then Eric is going to talk a little bit about his Veterans Village experience. The site plan I sent out was the one that they had originally proposed. And when it came back, it got a little scaled down. And so he's going to talk about that for us. And then just in Medford, the urban campground they are offering is 120 sites. And those are really, there's not very much room in between each one. I didn't provide a picture of it, but they're really like chalk lines on grass and not very much room between each. So there's that potential as well. And one thing we are finding with the outdoor shelter examples is that they're really different. Veterans Village, St. Vincent, they're engineered building plans, they're on foundations versus the campground site. And so that might be something we are considering, or just something we have to weigh when we're thinking about the outdoor sites and the zoning districts they can go in. This is a little bit of what I was just getting at. So should we be limiting these sites by the number of units or spaces, or by the square footage of the site? And then if we have time, we're going to talk about the types of review process we'll go through. And then we'll revise the code we sent you last time and bring it back to you for further review, if that makes sense. Elizabeth and Pauline, do you want to add anything before we go on?
No, I don't. You did. You got it.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. So here's our first example. And Eric, I'm going to rely on you to talk a little bit about this. So this is Veterans Village. The site is up in northeast or north part of town. It's about an acre, 0.25, 55,000 square feet, 15 units. The units are about 150 square feet. And the footprint is between 400 and 500 square feet in talking with Eric. They've got parking on site. There's a community building that's 3,000 square feet. And Eric, you can correct me if I'm wrong. And then setbacks, and it's zone mixed use employment, so ME. And maybe Eric, do you want to unmute and kind of elaborate on anything I've said? Uh-oh, we may have lost Eric. We'll just unmute if you can. But in talking with Eric about this site, the county wanted driveway access. Oh, he's raising his hand. One sec here, guys. Let me go back here. Maybe he got booted out. Okay. Eric, can you unmute?
Isn't it with a phone
Okay.
something like *6 or something? Maybe he doesn't know how to unmute with the phone.
Oh, maybe that's it. Oh, there he is. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, Zoom crashed on me, so then it kicked me
Oh.
out, and I don't think I'm a panelist anymore. But and I used to dial in audio just in case the video crashed. So anyway, you can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, what was the question?
we were talking about, like, when we talked yesterday about your site and just, and I can bring back up the site plan, but just, you know, it's a large site, 55,000 square feet. And once you kind of take away the setbacks and then the space for the community building, and then the requirements from the county for certain things, and I'm not gonna remember what that is, you know, there's not like a ton of room for a whole bunch of units. And then maybe you can talk about the sort of size you think is pretty doable for building pads and things like that. So I'm gonna go back to the site plan.
The layout. Yeah,
Yeah.
perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I'm out at the site today because we're going vertical, putting up some walls. So that's Heart of Oregon over there building some walls for us. And what we got is 15 cabins right now approved by the county. You can see the foundations. It's in a line. You know, there's a path between them, and they're fairly closely spaced. I think there's about 4 foot offset to, if you called it a lot line, between the two. So I came up with about 500 square feet as the kind of minimum dimension for a structure like this. This is 144 square feet, 12 by 12. And, you know, that's enough for a bed, a toilet, a sink, a closet, and a table with 2 chairs. So, you know, if it's 20 feet wide and 25 feet long, then you can, that 25 feet allows some extra distance in the front for a path between, you know, the 2 sets of, you know, offsetting or symmetric structures. And then we can fit, you know, another dozen or so here, but that's future expansion. So
We can't see your screen, but we're looking at the site plan, so.
okay, right. Yeah, so you can see that's kind of an L. The western edge of the property has a dozen or so sites, and then the southern edge of the property has a dozen or so sites. The community center is there in the center, and it's about 2,500 square feet. And that's showers, laundry, kitchen, common dining area, common community area, 4 case management offices, and a larger boardroom, you know, for something like, you know, larger meetings. The village has a council they elect, and so they need a meeting room for that. So anyway, and you can see some parking spots there on the right. There's 8 shown on that design. I think we have about 12 in reality, just the way the actual layout worked out. You know, I think in 1 acre, this is 55,000 feet, a little bit bigger than an acre, but in an acre you can fit about 25 structures with some nice, you know, elbow room for some expansion maybe, or a community garden. We're going to have a greenhouse and the community building and parking. I think, you know, 1 acre, if we just use the math, probably 20 would be the max if you're going to have a community building and parking. You can definitely fit more in. You know, ours are 12 by 12. You could probably do a 8 by 8 structure. I mean, that's very constrained, but that's about the size of Clackamas County. Kansas City's about, their structure is about 20 by 25. So 500 square feet versus our 150, and Clackamas is 80 square feet. So it really depends on what you're calling, you know, the minimum footprint of a single occupancy and a minimum footprint of a multi-occupant structure. And then I would add, you know, 4 feet all around and maybe 8 feet in front for a path and walkway.
Does anyone have any questions for Eric? Thank you. No, okay. Let's go on to the next one, and then we'll come back for a discussion. Let me just, here we go. So this is one of our safe parking program approvals. And so this was approved during the COVID emergency order. And this is Dawn's house. And it's over on Dean Swift Road. And it is about 1/3 of an acre site, about 16,000 square feet. It's got 5 RVs. They actually have, this is the manager unit. So in total, they have 5 RVs. And I was kind of curious how that related to the 500 square foot pad. And it's very similar. And so I think part of our kind of struggle in coming up with how many, whether we should regulate by size of parcel or set a number of, you know, maximum sites per zoning district. Is like, well, how much should, you know, a kind of a good thumbnail for the pad, how much room should that take up? So it looks like 400 to 500 square feet is sort of a reasonable size for these, based on what Eric has found, and then in looking at what we've got out there to compare. The state of Oregon also regulates campgrounds and RV parks, and they have pretty rigid, it's like 6-foot separation. If you've been, you know, to any campground, you kind of can envision a little bit of space in between campsites. So they're useful to look at, but I think they're probably looking at a lower density kind of situation than a property owner might want to provide for folks who are experiencing houselessness. And then I also want to make sure we check in with the service providers, with Stacy, with Dana, and you know, there's a certain capacity that's manageable for a service provider. So we want to make sure we're being sensitive to that, because if the sites get too big, they're hard to manage. So maybe we could talk about that. But just for Dawn's house comparison, so the RVs are pretty much self-contained. They have additional porta potties on site and hand washing stations. And I could pull up the decision. I can't remember how many we required, but the property also has setbacks, driveway. It has an existing house here that is empty. And I think eventually they're hoping to house people in that house. And it's zoned medium density residential. Anyone, Stacy, I know you're familiar with Dawn's house. Do you want to comment on anything I've said that might be wrong?
Absolutely. The only thing is that that small ADU house is occupied. It was covered under an emergency bed. So it varies. I think it can vary from 2 to 4 people in that house. And it's really a nice house and a great setup. So just the one thing I would want to make sure that we are mindful of is we're concerned with density, but at the same time, I think we have to take in consideration that not all, but many of our unhoused community members are battling with numerous mental health conditions, PTSD, things like that. And so I think it's really important that we're not putting people like right on top of each other, because that can be a real trigger. As a service provider, I love how Veterans Village has started with this 15 units because it's really manageable. I think we want to set these programs up and we want to do them well. So cramming in tons of people in a small space is just a recipe for disaster, I think. And I think we have to kind of think too about each other. Like if we were going into a housing unit or a site like this, what would be comfortable for us as well. And our unhoused community deserves that kind of thoughtfulness and dignity. So I would just add those components. And I know talking with the PD, I can't speak for them, but I know that when you talk about huge groups together, from any community, there is just more risk of challenges. I know I'm running the safe car parking over at Nativity Lutheran, and we purposely limited those spaces over there. Right now, our MOU is under some changes. We're signing that today, and they have reduced our numbers to only 3 vehicles. And that is not a city code. That has to do more with Nativity Lutheran's preference moving forward.
Okay, great. Does anyone else have input on that?
Just Suzanne,
Yeah,
just an observation on if we were to write a number for the length of the site, for instance, it occurs to me that if a family were fortunate enough to have perhaps a longer trailer, they might not be able to take advantage of this opportunity. And that could mean a larger number that we wouldn't be accommodating where we might otherwise. And when it says fifth wheel, it occurs to me, we say no parking in this slide, but if it's a fifth wheel, something probably towed it there. So I guess I'm wondering where you parked that big truck that towed a fifth wheel. beyond that, I mean, I'm suggesting that we were talking unintended consequences. Potentially, when we write a number here, we unintentionally exclude some people that may be fortunate enough to have a larger RV or fifth wheel.
Yeah, that's a good point. Mhm.
So I wanted to bring up the idea of a proportion as opposed to a specific number, because I think it does give us or gives applicants flexibility depending on how large a site is. But I did want to mention, as an architect, I have acreage embedded in my brain. And so if you were to divide 43560 by 1,000 square feet, for instance, you get 43. So, is 43 sites on an acre too much? It sounds like from what Stacy is saying that is too much. What I was trying to do is think of, okay, well, let's double the number from 500 to 1,000 just to take into consideration circulation, parking, a common building, and that sort of thing. It still seems that that's probably too many people per acre. So I just wanted to throw that out there in terms of, getting a sense of scale. If you're dividing up an acre, how many people do you think should be on there? What I would like to see is us not be too restrictive so that there's options when people come forward, that we're not precluding them, much as Hans just talked about a fifth wheeler. Let's give it enough structure that it's there and it makes sense, but not so much that it excludes things. So I just want to put it out there. I don't know what the magic number is, but I'd like to see us be as flexible as possible and not try to assume we can understand every conceivable thing that could come forward.
To build off of what Kathy was just saying, this is Dana. I can't remember if it's HUD or if it's the fire department or all of the above, but there's like a certain amount of space in just a shelter. I know we're talking about outdoor, but there's a certain amount of space that's required per person. And so there are, if we just think about like space and accommodations and maybe there's a magical number for outside spaces, maybe there's not, but I just want to build off of what Kathy was saying, is that there are some requirements, but also we don't want to minimize what could be possible. Like someone could propose a project that's magical that we never would have thought of, with a really great map. And so I just want to agree with what Kathy was saying.
Yeah, great input.
Yeah,
Just
and
go ahead. Yeah.
I would just piggyback on that same thing. I was going to plus one Kathy's comments, and I'm a math guy, and so you think about there's some fixed area for community building and parking, and then the variable amount is, well, how many, is it 500 feet or 600 or 300? You can fit in the rest of the space, and then there's some carrying capacity of land, for humans, and 40 people per acre, sounds like a max carrying capacity. And you have sewer and water and all of these other needs. And, then the management, that was spoken about earlier too. And some number is manageable and some number is not. The community we're modeling after started with 15 and then expanded to 25. And I said, are you going to go to 40, which was their original goal? And they said, that's just not going to be manageable. It's just too big a number. And so I can concluding all these comments is, it's probably not, you can't write zoning or code that's a formula, but we talk about having some flexibility, and every time we put a finite number down, it limits the flexibility. So there must be some methodology where we can say, these are the guidelines, minimum, maximum, range, those types of things, so that it gives, if you had a really small parcel and you could only carry 4 people, but it's, it doesn't meet these minimums, then it limits the capability to add more capacity in our community.
Yeah,
Eric,
great
did I
point.
understand you to say that we can't write code that would have a ratio, for instance, with spaces not to exceed 60% of the total acreage? We can't do that in code?
Oh, I don't know anything about code, so
Okay.
I was just saying, it seems like you can't, but it would be way better to have those kinds of mechanisms than a finite number like 15 or 20 or 12 or, 80. Because the parcel size is going to change, right? Every parcel is unique, and 15 is a great number for 1 acre, but it's a terrible neighbor. Maybe it's a terrible number for a 1/4 acre or an 1/8 of an acre.
It may not be linear, but it seems that if we could make it a ratio, that certainly speaks to the concern of not becoming overly dense to the point that we're less successful as a sustainable facility.
I mean, I think parking is ratio driven, and so I don't know why sites couldn't be ratio driven, where it's like a y equals mx plus b. B is your footprint for community building and parking, which actually is probably a variable also, but let's just say it's not for the moment. And then, x is the number of sites, and m is your ratio of, density. But not to dork out on math, that's just how I think of it.
I think we could actually, Pauline, do you want to speak to that?
All good ideas. I think, probably some type of regulation. So when the planners have to review what is being proposed, we have something to review it against, and it could be anything as long as we come up with something that works. There are lots of good ideas. It's hard to say what's the best.
As long as we're clear and objective, right, Pauline?
Well, Hans, that gets down into whether or not we decide what process we're going to go through. If we want to allow some discretion, then we're definitely looking at the type 2 process. And that's okay too, if we want to have some discretion. If it was very specific standards, then we could probably consider a type 1 process. But I think it's important first to decide what standards we want, and then we can talk about the process.
Megan, I see your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question and then sort of a follow-up based on that question. What is, does HB 2006, what does it say about managed camps? Someone from the city.
2006 just says to not create an unreasonable danger to health and safety, essentially. So sites or locations or shelters that are coming in under 2006 are not bound by the same kind of paving standards that anything coming in under the development code is. So that's how you see, I think we'll get to the St. Vincent example that shows some gravel where our development code would probably require pavement. And so anything coming in under 2006 does not have to comply with the provisions in the development code.
Okay. Because, one of the things that council is really trying to move along is a managed camp as soon as possible. And I would just want to make sure that as we're talking about this, they're like what Medford is doing is, it was a state of emergency, right? And they're saying we need to get a camp as soon as possible. And there's porta potties, there's no electricity. They just have 24-hour staff, and the sheriff's office provides breakfast every day for the camp for like over 100 people. The idea is we just need to get people in a safe environment. And so I just want to make sure as we're doing this, if we're sort of relying on this code, we need to think about the fact that we need to get people in a safe camp as quickly as possible. And how can we, allow for that in these decisions that we're making today? That's
question for Elizabeth. Isn't 2006 is only through July of 22? Is that correct?
That's correct. So applications for sites to be developed under 2006 have to be in by July 1, 2022. And then they have to open within 2 years of their approval date. But it's not it's not out there forever. So after July 1, 2022, this is the code that would apply to further shelters, the code we're talking about today.
Yeah, so my 2 cents is, 4212 was the speed thing. So I think it was Megan that was saying, we want to do something quick. Well, in 2006 allows the quickness too. I mean, if it supersedes the development code, which is the opposite of quick, then you can do things quickly. And that's what 4212 and I think 2006 is doing. So if 2006 expires, the city of Bend's code, its emergency shelter siting application, whatever you want to call it, needs to have the same components that were successful in getting things done quickly, under 4212 and potentially under 2006. And that generally is saying, use the building code so that we know we have health and safety taken care of and basic design. Shelters aren't going to blow away in the wind. They're not going to collapse under snow. All of that is handled under the building code. The development code gets a lot more complicated. And I think things like, you mentioned the St. Vincent having gravel. We have gravel. Joe said we could use gravel initially, and that is a speed thing, because if you require paving, which I heard us say earlier, that's just a giant delay. It's an extra cost. It's unnecessary. Yes, you can pave ADA sites, but if speed is our goal for outdoor camps, the development code is not going to allow for speed. And you need ways to mitigate things, because your building department will make high quality decisions in the best interest of the city, in the best interest of the occupants, that isn't really relevant to the development code as much as it is the building code. So I think you still have you have every safety you need. You just, with going through the building department, you'll have the speed that you don't have, I think, if you have the development code overlapping everything. Thank you for listening.
That's kind of what I was getting at. Thank you so much.
Okay, anyone else have, Kathy? Looks like
Yeah,
you
so
do.
how do we get around the requirement for paving? Because that's such an enormous cost. And so can there be, in what we're doing here, allowing an exemption to the paving requirement? I mean, because what Eric is saying is absolutely true. And I think that what we want to do is allow people to respond to the situation going forward beyond the expiration date. And if one of the biggest hangups is having to do paved parking, then I think we need to be addressing that somehow. And I'm glad Scott brought it up last time, because it really is an impediment.
Kathy, I want to echo that too. When I think in terms of things that the public might push back on, gravel versus pavement, I don't think that's one that's going to give anybody heartburn. And it's such a big impediment. If we can find a way to deal with that, I agree. I think that's not one that we have to sell or defend, and it really facilitates the whole process.
I'm glad you said that.
I was wondering if there was a way, we, in the code, we require a certain number of parking spots per development. And so when we say the word parking spots, then it goes to the definition of parking in the development code. Is there a way that we could say we require a certain number of, and just an alternate definition? And then within the definition, that alternate allows gravel. So we would essentially be saying no parking besides maybe ADA parking required at these sites, but instead it requires this other thing. And then that other thing is defined in the development code as a parking space, but not necessarily one that has to have all the same requirements associated with it, like a typical parking space.
So Scott, I think, the way the code and the way these sort of special sections of the code work for special uses, it says, unless superseded under this code, the standard provisions, for example, for parking would apply. So I think there's probably a way, and I think we can take your comments of trying to balance, ADA versus speed and expediency. And we could probably come up as staff with a proposal for you. I think there's some concern about keeping gravel back from the paved roadway so that we're not having gravel onto the right of way. And so there may be a driveway apron requirement and then paving requirements for ADA required spaces. But it sounds like as staff, you'd like us to come up with some examples or put some thought into how to create a separate standard that would not require paving for driveway aisles or all the parking spaces for these types of uses.
Yes.
And there's probably language already, Elizabeth, with regard to EBAs that have that requirement for the paved access driveway cut. At least in my experience, I've seen that in various codes in different cities that I've worked in.
What was that acronym you said, Kathy?
Oh, emergency vehicle access, EVA, oftentimes is gravel, especially like if it's next to a canal or something like that. And usually there's just a requirement for the driveway cut to be paved to prevent the gravel from going into the roadway. So there's probably some language already in the code that you could look at to refer to.
Thank you.
Hey, great discussion. Pauline, did you have anything, or Colin, that you wanted to add to that? Okay, so we'll work on some language and get that to you. And because we're not meeting for a month, we might do some, send it out email or something like that. I know no decisions can be made in email, but at least you can look at it ahead of time and get your thoughts together and stuff.
Also, I think if we were able to establish some sort of kind of alternate parking standards, I think there's benefits that go beyond what we're talking about here in terms of seasonal things, where parking might be very specific to, I mean, I guess, don't we have something in there for parking for events and things like that we could draw from?
I think so. We can take a look. I'm not familiar with the special event stuff, but yeah, you're right.
I think of like the parking lot by Deschutes Brewery. There's got to be something there, or I don't know how that works.
Yeah, I'm sure we can figure out something.
So Scott, what you're probably thinking about is actually under our temporary use code, there are some different standards for uses that will last less than a certain, a few months at a time. So if there's like a pop-up farmer's market or a farm stand or something like that, those are under the temporary use code. And so that's, the second half of this outdoor shelter discussion is, are there even fewer requirements or even different requirements for a shelter that might operate only for a portion of the year? And so I think right now we're talking about an outdoor shelter site that would open permanently. And then we can also get into, are there different standards that you might want to talk about for a shelter that would only be open for 6 months and then would close? So that's the second half of this discussion.
Yeah.
And then just really quickly, going back to the occupancy, I just think we have to be careful of the language because, for instance, at safe car parking, we don't say how many people, we say how many vehicles. And at Dawn's house, each unit may have obviously more than one person because they're catered towards families. So it might mean that we put in some code that says we can have X amount or the maximum of X amount of units or sites per acre. I know campgrounds, I was reading a little bit, I think they're 50 by 50 required at campgrounds, which is a huge area. If I'm not mistaken, that's like 2,500 square feet. But I think really listening with Eric's guidance on the Veterans Village, you have a visual of what that kind of 500 feet looks like. So I don't know, just, it's hard to come up, but maybe we come up with a maximum per acre.
Okay, anything else on that? I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again, and we've got the one last project to look at, which is just being reviewed right now. And that was another one that was reviewed just the same as Veterans Village, so the House Bill 4212. And so it was like a super siting bill, which is essentially what House Bill 2006 is gonna allow us to do in this next year. So from now until the next year. Okay, scroll down here. So let's see. So the St. Vincent de Paul's micro village, and Lynn, if I'm missing something, feel free to chime in. You were the main person reviewing this. Oh, this is the wrong one. Here we go. So It's on 2 parcels actually, totaling about 1/3 of an acre. So this one has 10 sleeping units. They don't have individual bathrooms inside the units. Instead, there's a common community room with showers, laundry, restrooms, and then there's a single family residence for a family emergency shelter. Each unit is 12 by 10, so a little smaller than the Veterans Village models, and there's a minimum of 6 foot in between. They've got 12 parking spaces shown, and it's zoned commercial limited commercial. It's on Cleveland. So these are a little bit smaller, but you can see, you know, it's about the same type of thing. They've got 10, but then they've got the single family residence as well. Not sure what else to say about it. Lynn, do you have anything else to add, or anyone else have any info on this one they'd like to add?
Yeah, I think one of the critical differences between this and Veterans Village is that the St. Vincent de Paul sort of operations center is adjacent to these parcels, and so just off the map to the north. So they have been operating some rental units for a number of years, and they have their offices right there. So there was a little bit less need for sort of that community space in this facility because that exists off these parcels than there was in Veterans Village where it had to be brought in. So that's one of the differences, and why I think this one, the residence facility, is able to be much smaller.
And
then,
Susanna, I'll also,
yeah.
oh, Susanna, I'll also say I just pulled out the size of these 2 lots. The lot to the left that has the 2, 4, 6, 8 built sleeping units and the resident facility is 6,200 square feet. So just to give an example of that's similar, I mean, it's to, you know, a smaller residential lot size.
Yeah, that's a good point. This one, Elizabeth?
Yes, where those 8 units are, sleeping units are.
I was
Yeah,
just,
good
this
point.
is Brianna. I was just curious how they're getting around the fire rated wall, or if they are, just because it's a cost, with being 6 feet apart rather than 10. Is it because they're
That meets the code. It's a
the
3
6?
foot. Mhm.
Okay.
Okay, anyone else have any other comments? So yeah, these are graveled, so definitely something we could look at in our work here. But you can see, yeah, there's only so many we can get on the sites. So, but I think it's interesting to look at different models. So back to our questions. Regulate by number of sites, or the size of site, or both. So it should say number of campsites or units, or size of site, or both. And then the next question is, if regulated by size of the parcel, should we set a maximum number of campsites or units by zoning district? And then the last question, I might let Pauline explain this one. The minimum lot size in our lower density zoning districts, do we need to set a minimum lot size for development in these? And I'm going to let Pauline explain more of that.
My only thought on this was if we set a maximum number of pads or camping sites and they want to actually do more, are they going to come in and just create a lot of smaller parcels so that they can get more sites or pads on them? And then if we want to still stick with like the lot size that we would require for like your normal single family duplex, triplex type houses, like in our low density residential, they all have a minimum lot size of 10,000 square feet. So would it be good to establish that these uses also start at a minimum lot size of 10,000 for the low density residential, like all the other residential type uses? And then in our standard density residential, the minimum lot size is 4,000. And then if we decide this is an okay idea, then we say, go back up to the first or second bullet and start saying, okay, so on a 10,000 square foot lot, how many units would we say is a maximum? Or do we even say that and just let the standards regulate that? So I think that's where Suzanne is saying, do we want to just say you have a minimum lot size and then we use the standards to regulate? Or do we not care about minimum lot size and just say the number of units that can be on each lot, or both?
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was just going to add one of the things that came up during the planning commission meeting for the old Mill Inn and Suites amongst the planning commission and amongst public comments was concern of creating districts. And because one of the things that had to be passed or that had to be changed in development code for that project to go through was to get rid of the 1,000 foot requirement separation between shelters. And we did it for that project, but there was concern that if that might have a cascading effect, and then it makes, okay, all the shelters get relegated to the east side, or neighborhoods can kind of, I don't know, it just can kind of create a homogeneous area of the city. And that's something that we, houseless populations, uber rich populations, it's never a good idea to create districts of homogeneity within the city. And so I think that this sounding board should be a little concerned about just how do we do that. I guess how do we write in rules in the development code that kind of dissuade creating just a big area of a houseless population without presenting too much of a barrier, I guess. And maybe
Scott, your
yeah.
comment goes to, I think, the concern that we might have, one facility after another facility after another facility, and just a long row of these. And I don't know how to go around that necessarily. Certainly, when we look at STRs, we say, oh, well, no closer than 250 feet. And yet the pushback comes from, well, that means I could have 10 in this neighborhood, or I could have 6 in this neighborhood. And I don't know if not to exceed language has any place in code, but somewhere in here, we want to be sure it's successful by not making the sites too dense. I like the idea of using the same lot sizes that we have in code. That makes sense to me. But I guess I struggle with how people perceive number of sites in total, or, is 10 sites of 10 a bigger problem than one site of 100? And I don't have an answer for that, but I'm just trying to kind of put that out there as we think about this, what stands the best rate of being accepted by the community, wherever we are in the community. Because we've got so many variables going on here between density and number of sites and size of sites, the idea of ratio to be sure we control density. Somewhere in here, there's a magic algorithm. I just don't know what it is.
Could I ask Lynn if there's a Fair Housing Act component in terms of there's certain districts that are lower income and you're not supposed to overly burden. Lynn, could you just mention what you're...
Yeah, so Bend has 2 named census tracts by HUD that are low income. I anticipate as soon as we get the census data, those will change, because those are the central area and Core Pine, which is the old mill. So currently that's what we're working with. If this group determined that all low income housing should be funneled to those 2 census tracts, we'd probably be in trouble. So that's sort of a clear black and white, in my opinion. Beyond that, I would say we definitely do want to be aware of sort of all of these considerations, and that we're not saying, oh, they can only go, in Northeast, or, oh, they can only go in RH, something that's going to be really, really hard to attain, I'd say. Beyond that, and I'm going to let Elizabeth jump in because I can only imagine what she's about to say. Beyond that, I think that it gets a little more technical and a little bit more analytic, I'll say, in terms of how we're analyzing things. But I think that the conversation that you all are having is super appropriate, and to keep it spread out if possible, to not try to limit it, to just 3rd Street or just any place in town. And the awareness that I'd like to put forward is that I believe, and please correct me, Pauline or others, if I have this wrong. Right now, single family zoning districts in Bend are something like 80% of our residential area. So keep that in mind. I know that there is huge pressure from neighbors to not have things in our RS zone that look like homelessness or houselessness in any way, but that is a vast majority of the residential districts that we have available in Bend. So just do keep that in mind. Compatibility is an issue, and I understand that completely. Yeah, I'll stop there, I think, and hand it over to Elizabeth. I don't want to cut her off.
No, I think, Lynn, you've got it. I think as we're thinking about, wanting to not concentrate these in any one particular area, that's an excellent, sentiment. That's a goal that I think the Fair Housing Act supports. I think we also want to be careful of putting in sort of a limitation that they can't go next to each other, because we don't say that for things like apartment buildings or other types of housing. And so I think it's a balance, right, of making sure that they are allowed with standards throughout the city. And then those standards are what should be used to control what they look like and that compatibility.
Is there a place for a paragraph introducing the council goals for this type of housing, where it could say that the goal is not to concentrate them in any one area? So it's more of a guidance, but not a rule, or is there no place for something like that in the code?
So it wouldn't necessarily be in the code, probably a reference to council goals. We do have findings when we adopt ordinances that say sort of what's the basis for these regulations that are being adopted. The place for sort of descriptive language in the code in sort of for our zoning districts is what's trying to be achieved by the standards in the zoning district. And I'm not, Pauline or Colin, step in. I'm not sure we have purpose statements under other types of standards in the code for different uses.
We do have purpose statements, but we put in the code to make it clear that the purpose statements aren't standards and we don't regulate them. So you could, put it there, but it's simply just a purpose statement, and that's it.
Could I ask a question? I don't know if anybody in this group knows, but is it true that most of our single family residential areas are covered by CC&Rs that would prevent this type of thing anyway?
Only if they're currently written, right?
There are a lot of CC&Rs. There's changes at the legislature, like Scott, I think you were getting at, there's changes at the legislature to restrict what could be in amended or new CC&Rs. There was also a recent challenge to CC&Rs where the CC&Rs of the community didn't allow for use of a recreational vehicle in the driveway as a dwelling unit, and someone needed that for a disabled family member. And they challenged the CC&Rs under the ADA. And they were successful in saying that the CC&Rs couldn't be enforced to keep someone who needed an accommodation for a disability out. So to say there are CC&Rs is not a black and white, but some things to take a legal challenge if there's a basis under some federal law to challenge the application of a CC&R in a particular instance.
Elizabeth, I have a follow-up question on that. I've gotten emails from people saying something to the effect that, well, if the HOA hasn't been active for many years, there's no way to enforce CC&Rs, so that they can just be basically ignored. And I don't think that's really true, but I don't know because I'm not a lawyer. So could you add to that?
Well, it is true that CC&Rs are a private contract between the property owners in a particular location. So it's a private right of action to enforce. To remove CC&Rs, you have to go through whatever process is in the recorded document to actually remove them. And typically that'll probably be a vote of 75% or more of the people or the property owners in an area. So if they haven't been removed, they're still there. What it would take to stand up an entity or to challenge a use that may be against what is written in the CCNRs. It depends on the terms of the CCNRs, who gets to enforce, if it's just another property owner or if it takes the HOA. So if they're still there, I would say they're still there. And it would take either the HOA or a neighbor bringing a private suit to enforce. So generally, it's an it depends answer, which I think most of my answers are. But that's generally how CCNR enforcement would work.
Thank you. And thanks, Barb, for bringing that up, because it is an issue like where we have a lot of larger lots in the old farm district where, you know, they were in the county and then brought into the city. And those are the ones that might be large enough to do something like this. But if there's CCNRs that prevent it, what can we really do? And it doesn't sound like there's a clear answer. And I highly doubt 75% of the property owners in that area would vote to allow a homeless shelter in their midst. That would be a really heavy lift. So
yeah, I feel like the natural process of some of these, and I don't know, but it seems like these facilities would go where land is cheap, because nobody's going to buy a super expensive parcel and put in a houseless camp. And like you were saying with the HOAs, there's kind of these barriers. And I guess I think back to, I went to school in Portland in Chinatown, and that area has a lot of facilities like that, methadone clinics and things, and it was very concentrated. And there were times when it was a pretty sketchy area, and you could go a few blocks away to the Pearl where there wasn't necessarily those, and it was a complete sea change. And it just seemed like almost like they were corralling a certain population, a certain area. And I'm kind of wondering, is there a way that maybe on future proposed master plans that there's a certain percent of land that they could set aside and say that this would be for houseless population or facilities like this? Is that something that could be possible, looking at like Pauline?
I can address that. And sorry, my camera isn't working today, so I'm not going to turn it on. So we don't have inclusionary zoning, which requires developers to dedicate a certain amount of property towards affordable housing or other types of housing that they don't want to do. Other than we do have some policies in the comprehensive plan for expansion areas that do require a certain amount of affordable housing in the form of units to be constructed along with the with the master planning. But those were sort of put on these properties that wanted to come into the urban growth boundary, and the owners agreed to those policies. So does that answer?
So something large like the Petrosa or something like that, we can, because we do regulate, you have to have a kind of certain percentage of commercial and residential, don't we?
We do have that, but we don't specify, well, we do require a certain split of unit types, but we don't have any requirements regarding the sort of the market rate that they have to charge for either a unit that they build or land that they create through a land division.
So until recently, that kind of inclusionary zoning that required certain inclusion of units at a certain price level was actually not allowed in Oregon. There is a limited allowance for mandatory inclusionary zoning. And what Colin is talking about is sort of this voluntary inclusionary zoning for when certain areas wanted to come into the UGB, they worked with the city and agreed to have a certain number of units at certain income levels. But that's not something that is imposed from the city on the property owners. That's something that was an agreement between the property owners and the city. So inclusionary zoning is a a large can of worms, I would say, that has a lot of arguments on either side about how to get there and what it accomplishes. But it's not something that we have in the code. It's something that's part of those agreements to determining which property to bring into the UGB.
Anyone else have any more comments or questions about that type of stuff? I wanted to go back and share the table we looked at that had the zoning districts and the number of sites. And maybe now that we've kind of seen the examples and talked through some concepts, go back and see if we can maybe get some more guidance on those. Anyone else have anything to add before? Okay. Let's see if I can put this over here. So this is kind of the table. I've taken it and I've, so you can see we've got the RL and RS zoning districts. So the RL is our lowest density. The minimum lot size for development of any type that Pauline was talking about is 10,000 square feet. And then for RS, it's 4,000 square feet. And then we could do, I thought maybe what we could do is kind of fill this out and see what it looks like. So this would be assuming a certain amount of space per unit. So as Kathy was talking about, maybe 1,000 square feet. Veterans Village, Dawn's house, both provide about 500 square feet per unit or pad. And then St. Vincent's is a little smaller but because they've got smaller units and kind of a different model. So I don't know if you're all comfortable just kind of coming up with some ideas to look at right now. And then, we can talk about it by zoning district. How do folks feel about that? I can't really see anybody, so please let me know.
Susanna, can I ask a question? Elizabeth, you said that, I think it was the model that had the 2 lots next to the church. What was the lot size of that, the smaller parcel that actually I think had 8 units on it?
I think you're talking about the St. Vincent de Paul. Yep. And so that lot that had the 8 sleeping units and a residence facility was about 6,200 square feet.
Yeah, the small lot was 775 square feet per unit, but overall it was about 1,600 square feet per unit.
This
if
one,
we did
Kathy?
1,000 square feet per unit, you could not have these 8.
Correct.
Okay.
Can you make the screen larger so it's we don't have to see all the little slides on the side, so it's easier to see?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Let's see.
And
So when Kathy suggested 1,000 square feet per pad or per unit, that was allowing 500 square feet of overhead per unit to contribute towards a community building and parking.
That's
right.
correct.
So we need to make sure we need to either talk about overall square footage or pad square footage. And I think it's better if we talk about pad square footage because the St. Vincent's a perfect example where they have offsite case management made right next door, but still it's offsite case management. So the 1,000 square foot per unit would blow out St. Vincent, but it's clearly a good project and it would clearly work. So I would again suggest that we try to constrain each component of the system versus the overall system, with a larger, fudge factor. Because at 30 units, you have too much space, for community building and parking. At 5 units, you have too little.
Yeah, good point. Hans, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, just thinking about your matrix, if you will, that slide where if we were to drop in, for instance, 4,000 square feet for RS, we all understand the math, but if it's 1,000 feet, that would make 4 spaces maximum. If it were minimum space I assume that space per unit foot is, I'm going to infer that that's a minimum so that we don't get overly dense. So if we put in 1,000, that means a 4,000 square foot RS could only have 4 sites. There's some repercussions of the number we pick here. And it's a balance clearly of having sufficient space, but not missing opportunities. And I don't know the number. I'm just reminding us that if we put it in terms of, as soon as we put lot size in there, space per unit foot, we should be able to zero in on an appropriate number. And it's probably not more than 1,000. It's probably not less than 500, but I'm just trying to give us some guidance to see if we can't, based on all the other things that we've mentioned, come up with a number that at least tentatively makes sense.
Right, Hans, and I think as you start looking at the different zones, you know, maybe the RL's 1,000 and you just start going to smaller numbers as you increase, as the zones increase in density. So RL being our lowest density and 10,000 square foot lots, maybe you, I'm not suggesting any numbers, it's just an example. You do 1,000 for RL, 4,000 is a little bit higher density zone. So maybe you do 750. I don't know what the number is, but you know,
But as
as
a placeholder, I like that approach. I mean, whether it's 750 and we come back and say 600 or whatever, just as a placeholder, at least that would help us in our logic of going down the different zones as well.
Well, yeah, I still would counsel against something like 1,000 because that included 500 square feet of overhead for parking. If you have a 4,000 square foot lot and no case management, I mean, the rest stops they have in Eugene, lots of these models, these outdoor camps don't have case management on site. They might have one shelter or one slightly larger building that's for on-site management, but you may not have a community building. And if you use these large numbers like 750 or 1,000, you're putting overhead on the project that it can't sustain. And a 4,000 square foot lot could easily have, 10 shelters, but at 1,000, you're going to get 4. And I really think we need to make sure we really constrain, the footprint of the pads to, the smallest number possible that still meets building code, still meets fire, still meets basic human dignity, so nobody's living on top of each other. Like was said earlier about, PTSD and having too high a density, but I just want to counsel us going against too low a density on the other side of it.
Finding the right number is a challenge, but just a comment that we have several times here, we've mentioned fire, and we don't have anyone that's here to give us guidance on some of the requirements in terms of fire requirements. Just something for us to think about going forward. But I agree. I don't know what the magic number is. So somewhere in here, there's kind of a push and a pull to find that perfect number, and we won't find a perfect number, but we'll find an appropriate number.
Eric, are you saying there are some places where there is not any type of community building on site? I understand case management might not be on site.
Yeah, I am saying that. It's an example of, maybe an emergency short-term solution, but they are, 6 months, and there might be, 60 or 80 square foot units with maybe 1 foot offset between each other. And I don't think that's a great long-term solution. It's not even the best short-term solution, but it's way better than saying you can't do anything and you have to live in the woods, right?
Isn't that one of the projects in Medford with built shelters that, little cottages that are really, they are just right next to each other as far as space.
Exactly.
Interesting.
I mean, in some philosophies, you could consider it just a wall. It's an outdoor shelter, but if it was an indoor shelter and they were all rooms, what's the smallest configuration room you can have for a human being? With a restroom down the hall. So you actually have things like Bethlehem Inn or other places that have much higher density in terms of the living area for the human. And when we start to constrain these outdoor shelters with large offsets and large overhead for parking and community buildings, which may or may not be even feasible or needed or part of the program, you're just going to have much, you're not going to, City Council has a goal of 1,000 units in this town. So we need to come up with some high numbers, and constraining the density almost arbitrarily to, 500 feet or 7 or 400, you're going to eliminate a lot of solutions that are working just fine to end houselessness.
Eric, what would you say if we tried to figure out what number of units do require some sort of on-site management or community building or bathrooms? Do you know what I'm saying? Because
I do. I mean, I think best practices say that you want case management on site and you want bathrooms, you want all of these things.
Right.
But then emergency dictates a little bit different things. I mean, back in the early days, we were talking about porta potties, gravel, but still meeting fire code, still meeting, health and safety requirements. And the density, is triple what we actually have now. So I you could do research on how many times you need case management. I think the state-of-the-art programs have case management, and that's what actually solves the houselessness issue. It's not the shelter necessarily that does it; it's the case management.
Right.
To jump in, and correct me if I'm wrong, Susanna and Elizabeth, but what we're talking about in this particular section is permanent outdoor shelters. And once we get through the 3 different types of permanent shelters, then we're going to talk about temporary, more like the emergency shelters requirements. So we'll have a separate section, I believe, for what Eric's talking about, like if there's an emergency situation, and we're not going to, have this specific of numbers because it would be considered temporary. And I don't know if that's 3 months, 6 months, what we define the temporary. But once we get to that section, then we would start putting in some minimal standards there.
So I
Yeah,
want to
that's
agree
correct.
with Eric about, what he was saying, because the number that I was throwing out did assume that there would be certain case management or common building on the site. So maybe this gets laid out with a different column for the individual pads versus accommodation for other, parking, community building, whatever. Maybe there's no limit on that size, but that there's a minimum for each little spot, the site. And Eric was saying that he thought in an acre you could have 10 people. So that would be 400 square feet. I mean, not an acre, excuse me, a 4,000 square foot lot. He was saying 10 people could fit there. And that would be 400 square feet per site. I don't know, Eric, if that's what you were thinking or not.
Yeah, I mean, it was an example with nice round numbers, but yeah, 400 is still a large sleeping structure, and you could probably still fit a toilet and a sink in it. That's not necessary, but yeah, 400 seems to me, from the design and talking to neighbors and thinking about the density and the services side, I think 400 without accommodating any, because we already talked about parking as a separate requirement in this code, in this process, and we already talked about on-site management or on-call management as a separate component. So if we design out the parking and design out the case the on-site management, because they're already in a different part of our code, and we're just talking about the density of the units now, I think we're just going to get closer to, a good minimum, but not that doesn't have excess overhead that constrains projects that would otherwise work without that overhead.
Because you were also talking about the fact that our building code is going to apply in terms of safety, fire safety. And so a minimum of 6 feet between structures in order to meet that requirement. So if you said 400 square feet, then there's going to be that 3 foot on all around. It probably would still give you the size unit that's functional. I don't know. I don't think that there's a perfect number, but I think it's a place to start.
Yeah, and it's about the same size as our
400
micro
included the 3.
Yes, exactly. The 400 includes the 3 foot of space all the way around it. So the unit is smaller than 400. It's just that 400 square feet per site allows for the fire separation as well as the unit.
Exactly, and some space between for pads, so that they can, Because if you put them all on top of each other, everybody's walking in between the units. You need some sort of walkway.
Right, exactly.
I
Scott,
wanna-
I cut you off. I'm sorry, Scott.
Oh, I was just gonna say that's about our 400 square feet, is about our micro unit maximum. So it's kind of a similar deal.
Scott, I had my hand up for a while to make that point. I wondered if all the work we did on micro units wouldn't help us on some of these numbers when we looked at how many units with a kitchen or how many square feet. A micro unit can be as small as 150 feet. I'm not suggesting that's a number, but maybe there's some value in looking at the work that was done on micro units. And certainly we got to an acceptance point on micro units. So it's nice to know that there's something that we could agree on at some point.
Yeah, and I was kind of wondering about the comment of once you hit a certain number of units, maybe then you do require some sort of on-site facilities. Again, I don't want to be too restrictive, but if we just say 400 units, 400 square feet per unit, and you have a property that could fit 200 units on it, wouldn't we want to also then require at some point have on-site management or on-site facilities?
That's kind of what I was thinking, Scott, that there would be some tipping point where, yes, some sort of on-site facilities would be required. Are we still talking about 5-foot setbacks along the outsides of the property? Or are we saying it's just 3 even for setbacks?
I think the setbacks are what the underlying zoning district would require. So
Okay.
Pauline, yeah, so it's going to
Good.
be different in residential than it would be in commercial.
Okay. Good.
Yeah.
So that, I think that gives us, the ability to put them closer together if we need to, knowing that standard that protects the neighbors. Yeah, thanks.
And I think what we could do between now and next meeting is sort of, we maybe get your input. I like the 400 square feet per pad, or I don't want to call it a site, but campsite or whatever. And then do some math based on different lot sizes and maybe get that back to you, like how many units that would be. And another way around this is to put a maximum number of shelter units by zoning districts. So in the lower density residential, this is where we kind of had started first. And I think some of the other cities we've looked at have done this as well. If there's a maximum of 15. I mean, I know we don't want to make something, if somebody has 16 units, that's like, make it, impossible to do. But maybe it's, you have to provide this much square feet per pad with a maximum of 15 units, or a maximum of 20 units if we want to go the higher, and then it grows based on the density of the zoning district or the type of uses allowed. So that's something, I don't know, if you wanted to provide us guidance right now on something like this, we could go back and do some math and figure out what that would actually mean as far as density goes.
May I just wanted to add one statement. I think this is all great, and I think we're moving in some wonderful directions. The one thing I do encourage everyone to continue to think about is I'm out in those camps and I talk to people every day, and there is a percentage of folks that are going to utilize these types of managed camps, shelter situations. The challenge we have in this region, which is unique to some areas, is we do have a large population of folks that are not going to choose some of these options. If you were to hand them keys tomorrow, they would choose to stay out on China Hat. And I just think that as we're creating this, we want to make sure that we're thinking about that, because I think down the road, we might have to look at some unique ideas of a camp that is more spread apart for those that are not able or willing to come in. It is a really unique region from anywhere I've ever lived before with our unhoused community members. But this gives people options, and it does provide spaces for people. So I think we keep going down that road. I just always like to remind people of the mindset of those that are living outside, that they would prefer many to live outside than to come into a 500 or 1,000 square foot space. So just so we're kind of thinking about that in the back of our minds.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, does anyone else have any comments before I move on? We're at 10:42. I think what we could do, just based on that 400 square foot per pad guidance, we could probably fill in the rest of this table and do some math and schematics and get you some information on that to see what these look like. And
I
then
can
we can
propose 20 maximum number of units for RLRS.
Anyone else have any comments on that? And of course, this is not final at all.
Well,
This
I
is
don't
Eric.
think,
That sounds good to me.
I appreciate your approach. I'm concerned about having maximum numbers at all. I think that if we could have the lot size and the space per pad and all the setbacks and fire access and parking issues dictate that we don't really need a maximum number. But, you know, I appreciate if there's a concern from neighborhood groups and so forth, this could get out of hand. But I'd like to first see what the numbers come out to with just using the proportion and the setbacks and
I
requirements.
like the way you think, Kathy. I think a maximum number is just a very simple number that the neighbors can look at that might reassure some anxious neighbors about just how big is the project going next door.
I also think it supports the operational standpoint, but maybe that's the management side where it kicks in at a certain, I could get around that if there was the management piece at a certain density that then that came in. So I guess there could be a combination of things that alleviate both of those.
Yeah, I like that approach, where you have a square foot per unit per pad, and then maybe if you hit a certain number of those, then you have to have, then there's some on-site management requirements or something. And then you just have a maximum number that probably wouldn't be reached, but at least it's reassuring because someone will see unlimited and they'll just envision 1,000 people next door to them sleeping in tents on top of each other.
Yeah, but we
and
talked
so-
about using the word limited by the constraints as being almost preferable, because if you put a number that's too big, people are going to freak out. And, you know, I just think, I don't know, I'm not a big proponent of having a specific number, but I'm going to go along with whatever the majority thinks.
Let me
Well, I
just
wonder
say
if it's
that
just,
I like,
to Scott's point and to Kathy's point, and also to Barb's point, I really appreciate the idea of a maximum number, but when we're talking minimum lot size, we could have a 20,000 foot RL, and if we said 20 max, that's a missed opportunity. So I have to say that there's a balancing act here.
so maybe it's units an acre.
It would
and
be just the planner to me, it would be 20 maximum per 10,000 square foot lot in the RL.
There you
So
go.
that does not work 20 maximum per 4,000 because you can never get to 20. So we'll play around with those numbers. So they actually, because normally on a 10,000 square foot lot, if you just divide it by 400, you can get 25. So instead of being at the very max of 25, we would put a limit of 20 if we go this route. And then we do the same exercise with the 4,000.
I like that idea. This is Eric. I think you need to have a clear, simple max number so the public will understand, you know, just the limit, right? It's not going to be the end of the world. It's a finite number and it's digestible and it's going to be under control.
Okay, so I think we have some direction there for next time. And it's 10:46, and I realized we didn't get to approval of the minutes. And then I also just wanted to share real quick on Friday, we'll be going to the community building subcommittee. So that is a small subcommittee of council. It's Barb Campbell. Thank you, Counselor Campbell, Melanie Keebler, and Rita Schenkelberg. And anyone can attend. The links on the city's website, but the 2 items are going to be parking minimums to have a discussion of whether that's, if we have the resources in-house to take that on at this point, and then also the work of this body. And so I'm going to be getting together a quick turnaround of kind of where we are and be sharing our progress so far with them. So I might have some info to share as we come back. They might have some ideas on this. It's just a chance for them to kind of dig into this type of work a little bit more than up on the dais with all 7 counselors on, when they don't have a lot of time to do this stuff. So I just wanted to mention that.
So I have a quick question.
Mhm.
I'm on that and I haven't received any emails
Oh, okay.
about that.
I will.
I know there is a Scott Winter that works for the city, and sometimes we get each other's emails, and so
Okay.
maybe that
I'll
might
send
be
you
an
the
issue.
invitation. Okay.
Yeah,
I'll
because
forward you
I'm
that.
on it and I've gotten those emails, so Scott needs to catch up. So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't gotten any. I haven't. It's been like over a year, I think. I haven't gotten anything.
We haven't met. I guess I'm kind of new to this too, and we haven't met for a while, so you haven't missed much. So,
Okay.
but we'll make sure you get the Friday one. It's Friday 3 to 5. So just what you want to do on Friday afternoon. So anyhow.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, by the way.
Yeah, okay. Just before I forget. So why don't, this was all great. I mean, I think it's really good discussion. Of course, we want to be able to like fill this out and move on to the next thing, but I think it'll be really good to do some kind of schematics of what 400 square feet would look like. And then maybe do a reality check on the number of lots we've got out there. I don't know if I can work with our GIS department to do this, but to kind of figure out like how many of these would we really see, just based on our availability of lots and our vacancy and our pricing and things like that. So I know Eric spent a long time with finding a site for Veterans Village. So finding land is probably our hardest thing to come by. And in terms of surplus, not surplus property, but property the city owns, we own Juniper Ridge and then a whole bunch of smaller pieces scattered around. And so, yeah, so it might be good to do kind of like a little bit of mapping and analysis to do a reality check on how many of these we would actually maybe see around.
Susanna,
Barb.
yeah, we're working with, in particular, the county and ODOT, trying to find those publicly owned pieces of land that are in the city. I don't want us duplicating effort searching out vacant pieces of property is all. So.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. No, I was more just to show like how little we have.
Exactly. And that's why I brought up the CC&Rs, is not only is it a little amount, but then you've got CC&Rs on top that might take precedence. I just wonder how much time we're spending on how many total possible lots, but either way, we're doing great work. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. So before I forget, we've got folks in the lobby. Let me go there.
Also, Susanna, do you want somebody to move to approve the minutes? Do you need that? I'm happy to make that motion if you need
that'd be
it to be
great.
quick.
Sure. Okay. Okay, go for it.
I move that we approve our previous minutes as submitted.
Second.
Okay, great.
Do we take
All
a
in
vote?
favor? All in favor?
Aye.
Did you get that, Kayla? Hopefully Kayla got that. Okay, great. Thank you. And let's see, is there anyone in the attending that would like to make a public comment? Got a few people in the lobby. Just raise your hand if you'd like to. I don't see anybody. Okay. Anyone? I guess not. Okay. So we had a little more time than I thought. So what we'll do is do those schematics. We'll come back with some ideas for you. Is there anything else? Yes, Hans.
Sorry about that. One last thing on this slide, we talked about it before. I would have to say, I think we would probably get more community acceptance if we observed a type 2 process. We just put that out there for our consideration.
Okay.
I would
yeah.
agree because it allows flexibility too. I think we're going to get very interesting proposals and there needs to be some ability to be flexible. And it sounds like there's not much in type 1 and there is that ability in type 2.
Yeah, let me just go back really quick. I hate to do this back and forth, but to the type 1s, type 2s type thing, just so you can see. So just something to think about for next time. Can everyone see the screen? Something strange has kind of happened to my screen. So here we go. So type 1 is no public notice. So it's a real minimal application, and Pauline, maybe you can chime in if I'm missing something. Only the applicant can appeal. So there needs to be really clear and objective standards. Rough fee comparison. You can see it's around $800 to about $1,100. There's also surcharges and things like that. So I don't want to get in trouble by saying this is the exact price because it's probably going to be a little bit higher. And then type 2 is where the neighbors are noticed within 250 feet of the property. There are provisions that would increase that to 400 feet or larger. It goes to the applicable neighborhood association and notice is posted on site. It can be appealed by not only the applicant, but the adjacent property owners, anybody who is a party to the decision. So a site plan for a new use with no building. So this is a little bit gray area. So if you're doing a community building, you would probably be bumped into this higher base fee. If you are not doing a community building and it's more like tent structures, campgrounds, it's substantially less. Of course, we have methods for fee waivers, not waivers, but fee supplements through the Affordable Housing Advisory Committee and methods like that we could talk about. But it is something to think about. So a little more expensive if you're building a structure.
Susanna, the biggest concern would be the appeal process. And I guess, is there a specific threshold or in order to do an appeal, there needs to be an appeal for something significant, and just because the neighborhood doesn't want it there, they can't appeal for that reason, can they, or can they? I mean, that would be the big hang up for me in the type 2.
Yeah. Elizabeth, do you want to weigh in on that?
Well, so, and I'll look to Colin as well if he has anything to add. I think, the process for appeal, if you are a party, which means you have commented, into the record on a particular application, and you think the decision maker has made a mistake, or you want to challenge on any particular issue, you could appeal to the next decision maker, and that's sometimes different. Colin can step in with the exact process, but I think sometimes the reality of the legal system and the appeal system is it's a delay tactic, or there could be legitimate issues to appeal.
So can we set the fee for an appeal pretty darn high? So it has to be a very serious thing. I mean, I don't want somebody just throwing $50 at it and appealing it endlessly. So I think
sorry, the appeal fees are set in the council fee resolution. And there are, I believe, limitations from statute on the costs.
But it's not $50. It's definitely more than that.
Yeah. Well, I just, what my concern about the type 2 is that there are going to be neighborhood groups that don't want this in their neighborhood, regardless of how well it's designed or how well it's going to be managed. And if they use the appeal process to delay and kill a project, that's not in anyone's best interest. At the same time, I see that because of the weird shaped parcels that are available and the awkwardness of how to design them, we're going to need some flexibility in the approval. So it's like, I like the approval, but I don't like the appeal. And I don't know what the answer is for that. Anybody else have a thought on that?
Yeah, type 1 is my vote. This is Eric. That's close to the process we used, I think, for Veterans Village, and it worked great.
So from Pauline's point of view, in terms of processing something through type 1 versus type 2, do we need tighter regulations that people can follow? You're nodding your head, yes. So I guess that's just something for us to consider as we move forward, because initially I thought, oh, flexibility type 2, but then the fear of the endless appeals, it scares me.
Exactly.
The language I sent out to you that was in the presentation that I sent to you last night has kind of an example of what we need from the city of Cannon for their RV park campgrounds, and there's others too, but I mean that's the type of code language we would need for it to qualify for a type 1 or fit in that type 1 box. So there's definitely more of a flexibility process for type 2. The other thing is that we haven't talked about the temporary type, the shorter term emergency, like fire shelter, things like that. Like Pauline said, we're going to come back to those. These are for the permanent uses. And so for something that is truly an emergency, I mean, it's all an emergency, but if there's a natural disaster and we need to provide 200 spaces for people like that, that's going to go through probably a different process and a much quicker and easier process. So for the permanent facilities, we could be a little more, have a more flexible process, and that might be harder to get through, but allow more flexibility and then have just this easy route for a quick fix in our temporary shelter process.
Could there be a designated ombudsman in the planning department to help the applicants move through this process that could allow type 1 to work, because you've got your hand held to a certain extent in terms of all the information that needs to be provided?
There could be.
Everything is time and money and personnel, but I don't think there are going to be all that many of these, but the ones that do come forward might need help to get everything together. I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe the providers are so used to doing this, they don't need that help.
We also have, like, for affordable housing projects, Karen is the point planner on that. She's very familiar with the code. And so they all go to her for the most part. And we fast track those,
Okay.
so maybe I can't say that we could do it, but maybe there's also a fast track process like we've done for affordable housing.
So if it was a type 1, but with help through Karen to make sure all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted, that might be a way of doing this.
And a type 1 is generally less time consuming because you don't have to notify anybody about the project. Type 2 is where the neighbors actually get notice of the project. So that takes time, and then you have to write a staff report, which takes longer, and there's notification periods, whereas a type 1 just doesn't have the same requirements.
Type
So like
1
in
is
our residential
consistent with,
districts, a type 1 is an accessory dwelling unit. To give you a comparison of scale of what we review in our residential zones under that process is just an ADU or a duplex.
Eric, what were you going to say?
oh, I was just going to say, going back to the comments I made earlier about having a process that was based on speed, 4212 and 2006, their language really looks a lot more like a type 1 approval process than a type 2.
I guess I would ask the counselors here on the call what their thoughts are about not giving any public notice and how you feel about that. You know, because it's a double-edged sword.
It absolutely is. I am the personality type that unless I can actually do something about what is being proposed, I don't see the point in letting me know. But I absolutely understand that other people are completely the opposite and they want to know everything, even if there is no path for them to change the outcome. And the way I see it, it's just personalities, and we can just choose one way or another, and it just won't be perfect and people will be unhappy. So.
I just wanted to ask a naive question because I'm not real familiar with this. In a type 1, is it possible not to ask for people's permission so much as a notification that this is what's happening, so that you can, like in our safe parking, what we did, we sent a letter out to the neighbors stating this is what will be happening at Nativity Lutheran. We'll be having up to 6 cars. There will be daily case management. If you have questions or concerns, call this case manager. And I don't know if there's something like that so that we are at least honoring those around, but we're not opening the door to all of these appeals in this process. And I don't know if there's something like that, a hybrid that we can do.
We talked about that when we amended the code for accessory dwelling units. There was a council member or two that was interested in it. We call it kind of a neighborhood notice. The hard part about that, it gives the neighbor a false sense of expectation that they can comment on a project, and they can't. So then that they're just being notified, but it almost upsets them because they can't do or say anything about the project. So a tough one.
It is.
Is this something that we could afford to leave to the outreach segment? It seems to me like, you know, we could see what the public weighs in on. I have an expectation of what the public will say to us, but we could propose that there is 2 sides to this, advantages and disadvantages, pros and cons, and maybe see what the public says.
We could do that. And I think it might be a good question to pose on Friday, the community building subcommittee, just to say these are the main things that we're sort of struggling with. What do you think about it? You know, and maybe get their input. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, because I agree with what's been mentioned. It's like, if you let people know about something, they have this expectation that they can change it or stop it. And when that doesn't get changed and it doesn't get stopped, they're even more angry. I don't know what's better, but I think it's up to the council to really give us some feedback on that, because they're the ones that are going to take all the heat.
Best practice is definitely to notify, like in the case that was mentioned earlier, and that's what we did here at Veterans Village. But if you don't codify notification, then people won't do it. And I think it's better to have people disenfranchised with thinking they have input because they were notified than the opposite, which is not notifying them and the disenfranchised from that.
Yeah, I think sometimes those neighborhood meetings, it's not as much neighbors giving their advice as the developer or, you know, whoever's putting this on, explaining to the neighbors exactly what's going in, and to maybe you know, challenge a little bit of their pre-existing ideas of what's going to happen.
Yeah. Okay. Good input. Well, why don't we see what community building subcommittee has to say? I can report back. And I think since we're at 11:06, I want to be respectful of folks' time. So this was a really good discussion and gave us a lot of guidance. So Pauline and Elizabeth and I and others will go back to the drawing board and sort of come up with some ideas before the next one. Yeah. So feel free to reach out to me if you have any other comments or anything in between. And yeah. And Megan, anything you'd like to say? Barb?
You know, I just did want to say that it became even more clear this last week to me about my role on this committee. This committee does not advise council. That's where I consider it just like not fair for myself to be truly participating in a meeting. That's when I'm the liaison, is when that committee advises myself, right? You know, I don't get to advise myself. This committee advises the city manager. So if you've been wondering why on earth is Barb Campbell raising her hand so much, that's why. We, you know, we get to participate in this committee. So thank you all so much. Thanks for tolerating all of my ideas and suggestions and questions. And thank you all so much for yours and your participation. It's just really important.
Okay, thanks. Megan, anything to close?
You know, just that, Kathy, don't worry about us. We can take the heat. And I think all of us, I shouldn't speak for all of us, but I will, you know, this is such an important thing that we need to be doing. And we recognize it as a true emergency and a community emergency. And so anything that we can be doing to make these things actually happen, I know that the council will take all the heat that we need to take in order for it to happen for our unhoused neighbors.
Great. Okay. Thanks a lot, everyone. See you in a few weeks. Okay. Bye.